I'd like to welcome you to today's Medical Center Hour. I'm Marcia Day Childress from the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and I'm delighted to see all of you here today. Our presentation today, What Goes Without Saying, the Story's Silent Twin, is the School of Medicine's annual Moore Lecture, always offered by a physician writer and/or celebrating the art and craft of writing by physicians. Moore Lectures over the years have shown us the quite powerful mutuality of writing and doctoring, and indeed they've demonstrated that writer and doctor have much to teach and learn from one another. I'd like to just spend a moment telling you about the origins of the Moore Lecture. It memorializes Dr. Ellis C. Moore, a 1927 UVA medical graduate who had a long and successful career as a practitioner of EENT. These are the days when it was eye, ear, nose, and throat. He had a practice in a small town in upstate New York. Before deciding to study medicine, though, Dr. Moore was an elementary school teacher in his native Mississippi. And I like to think that his instincts, commitments, and skills as a teacher carried forward to inform his care of patients. Dr. Moore's two sons made a gift to UVA through the Medical Alumni Association to create this annual lecture. Our Moore lecturer this year, I'm very happy to say, is one of our own, a longtime member of the UVA faculty and a cherished colleague in our Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, Dr. Margaret Mohrmann. Rather like Dr. Moore, Dr. Mohrmann is both physician and teacher. In her case, a pediatrician as well as a professor of religious studies. And she has fused these two pursuits in her teaching and her writing. You'll find a biographical sketch of Dr. Mohrmann in your handout. As a physician-writer, Dr. Mohrmann describes herself not as a doctor born to write, but as one who's had writing rather thrust upon her. Regardless of how she came to write, she has done so beautifully and made it work for her beautifully in ways and works that illuminate not simply the world of doctoring, but also the moral life and growth of the doctor. She'll talk with us today about a not so obvious aspect of the writer's work, what goes without saying, the ghost narrative or further story, the meaning, the teaching that resides in the silences or hides in the structures of the written text. They are to be teased out by readers and even by the writer herself, paying close attention, much as a doctor attends compassionately to a patient. Following Dr. Mohrmann's presentation, Dr. Daniel Becker, the Kluge Professor of Palliative Medicine and Director of our Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, and himself a physician writer and editor of our own journal, Hospital Drive, Dr. Becker will offer a brief response. And we look forward to a wonderful hour. Welcome.
Thank you, Marcia. And thank you, Danny, for this. I'm really honored to be here as the Moore lecturer. I have always enjoyed this forum. I've always enjoyed being down here, whether moderating or being a responder, the few times I've been able to present. And it's a particular pleasure, though, to be here in this capacity. It's also sort of odd because it means I have to start thinking of myself as a physician writer, but that's probably a good thing, too. Think about how that evolved and what it has meant and what it will mean for my work. You heard in Marcia's remarks, and it's in the introductory paragraph of your handout, that I identify myself as a writer who had writing thrust upon her. And I'm going to start by explaining that, and then talk some about where it took me and what it's helped me understand. Almost 30 years ago, in 1984, when I was still teaching at the Medical University of South Carolina, the fourth-year medical students asked me to give their oath address. This was a ceremony, the oath ceremony, that the students had the evening before the big university commencement. It was the event at which they took the Hippocratic Oath and they received their doctoral hoods, and it was very much for the medical students and their families as opposed to the next day's commencement, which involved all the other schools. And they normally asked a faculty member to address them during that, and they invited me to do that in 1984. I recognized it, the invitation, as a real opportunity, and really the first ever such for me, opportunity to gather together what I thought I had learned by that point. Now, I was only 8 years out of residency, so what did I know? But nevertheless, and to articulate it, an opportunity to articulate that in a way that perhaps these students could hear and benefit from. And I learned a number of things from that experience. I learned that I could do it, that I was able to do it. I learned that I really enjoyed the process of distilling what I rather presumptuously then thought of as the wisdom of my experience. 11 years out of medical school. I liked how the act of writing helped me think about my vocation and my life and my teaching. And on top of that, it was well received. So I thought maybe I really am able to do this effectively. So, what writing did to me and taught me. I was invited to do it again in 1986 and 1987, and by the time I gave the final oath address, it had become my valedictory, because what writing and speaking, among a number of other things in my life, had done to me was change my entire career. I came here to pursue a doctorate in ethics, or actually, I came to graduate school in religious studies in order to combine my interests in medicine and theology and philosophy and history and literature, and I found, largely thanks to the very sensitive guidance of my indispensable mentor, Jim Childress, who's hiding back up there. Thank you, Jim. I found that ethics is the place one can stand in and do all that interdisciplinary thinking and writing and teaching, so ethics it was for me. And then, while I was working on my doctoral dissertation, I was asked to give a series of talks to a conference it's called Medicine and Ministry, but it's loosely patterned on, you may be familiar with Paul Tournier's post-war European conference, Medicine of the Whole Person. This was a much bigger project. It was more demanding than those 15-minute oath addresses I'd given, and it ended up becoming the core of my first book, which was published in 1995, and I'm happy to say is still in print and still selling, and even happier to say I just got a royalty check yesterday. And that book led to my being asked to give a lot more talks. So I ended up doing a lot of speaking, which is the way that my writing sort of took shape, was informing these talks. I spoke around the country at various places, usually to health professionals, often in a grand rounds format, or to religious groups interested in thinking about healthcare, groups of hospital chaplains, for example. I gave a lot of talks. And the talks were largely about doctoring. They were about the illness experience, at least as the health professionals see it. And all of these talks, like this book, like the earlier addresses, in all of them, I included bits of stories from my own experience in pediatrics. And I used these fragments of stories. They were, a few sentences, maybe a paragraph. I used them to illustrate points I was making. But I didn't deal with them as stories. Instead, it was as though my experiences were particulate. They were events that stood on their own, bits of information, unconnected in themselves, but with a sort of linear trajectory. They were like little life lessons, frozen in a moment of time that could be extracted from their context and displayed like little gems of wisdom, unchanging, always only what they are, or rather what I thought they were when they happened. But even while I was fragmenting the stories, I was breaking them open to harvest these small kernels of meaning, the whole stories were still in my head. They were still talking to me. And eventually, I paid enough attention to them to start thinking that maybe, like light, maybe experience is also both particle and wave, if you'll pardon my stretch of that analogy. Maybe, is that not a cool slide? Yeah. Thank you. I take no credit for it. And luckily, it's also irritating, so I put in a little placeholder slide. I'll get rid of it in a minute so it won't drive you nuts. But maybe that in our lives, the experiences that form our stories are not particulate lessons. They don't stand still. They're not fixed in amber. They're ongoing narratives that do connect. They're not necessarily linear, but they have, and here may be the important point, they have a lot more to tell us than we think they do. So what I want to talk about then is the rest of the story. Why we don't tell it, perhaps why we can't tell it, but why recognizing it, or sometimes just recognizing its absence, matters. So therefore my title, What Goes Without Saying, and the colophon to the title, which is a phrase I borrow from a book I recently read by Jeanette Winterson, the story's silent twin. Winterson, you may recognize, as the celebrated author of a number of rather edgy novels, the first of which was Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which was published in 1985 and was a sort of vaguely autobiographical novel about a young girl's difficult childhood and adolescence in the home of her really quite unusual adoptive mother. But 25 years later, referring to this novel, Winterson wrote this. It seemed to me that what I had left out was the story's silent twin. And this she wrote in a memoir, not a novel, memoir that was published only about a year ago with the marvelous title, Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal, which is the question her unusual adoptive mother leveled at her when Winterson, as a teenager, disclosed her sexual orientation. So, what is this silent twin? Well, it is what goes without saying because it's the story we cannot tell. And that for a number of reasons. To begin with, there are real constraints on health professionals as to what we can tell. Honoring the privacy of patients and our obligations to maintain confidentiality is crucial. The constraints are not just HIPAA rules. They would and they do exist without those rules. They are part of morality. They are responsibility. They are what we owe to the people who entrust themselves to us. So I struggle with what I can and can't say. This is a complicated and contested topic in the ethics of medical storytelling, and we could probably spend an entire medical center hour talking about that, and I think I know people that have to do it. We will set that up. But it's not what I want to really talk about today. There are other reasons why we don't tell the whole story, and one of them is it's too hard. It's too difficult sometimes, just too hard to replay these stories, too hard for someone else to hear them. And I mean that in at least two senses, related senses, but it may be too hard to tell and too hard to hear because it just really is too much to handle, too much to swallow in one go. So as T.S. Eliot said, humankind cannot bear very much reality. When that Louisville basketball player, Kevin Ware, we've all heard about, broke his leg in a game a few days ago, his teammates and the rest of the audience averted their eyes, and the television network realized pretty quickly that they had to stop replaying the video. It was too much. It is sometimes more than enough that a terrible event is experienced once at the time it occurs, and it may be more than anyone can bear to repeat it. Survivors of terrible violating trauma certainly know this, and so should their therapists. These are the sorts of experiences, actually, that may call for other modes of expression, other than a straight-out story of what's happened. These are experiences that sometimes call for art, for painting or music, or for poetry. I had the good fortune this past summer to attend the writing retreat for health professionals in Taos, New Mexico, that is led by one of my favorite poets, Becker. And I took that opportunity to explore writing poetry for myself. For me, a very different way of writing, but a way that I recognize can allow us sometimes to tell unspeakable stories in a way that tells their truth and that helps us work through their effects without having to re-inflict the trauma. Thinking about Kevin Ware's injury, for example, when I was preparing this, I was musing on the difficulty of paying attention to a story like that. And I found myself thinking in parallel, in metaphor, about the recent snowstorm and about the strong young trees that snapped off and fell in our yard under the weight of the wet snow, not incidentally taking our energy with them. Metaphor sometimes is a way in which we can express things that are difficult to look at and difficult to remember. Emily Dickinson said it famously, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." Now, Dickinson was not recommending, I don't think she was recommending that we be devious, that we should routinely distort or withhold the truth, but rather she was claiming the same idea that Eliot expressed later, the idea that we often cannot handle the whole truth, at least not all at once. Here's the rest of that verse. Success in circuit lies. Beating around the bush is sometimes a good thing to do. Too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. I think of the kinds of stories we have to tell when we give bad news to a patient. And what we learn from the experience about what it may mean to tell the truth, much less all the truth in such a situation, and what it entails to speak both honestly and compassionately, fitting our words not only to the medical facts of the matter, but also to the reality, the temperament, the needs of that person in front of us. And also inevitably fitting our words to what we ourselves, the storytellers, can bear of truth's superb surprise. For some stories really are too hard to tell because they're just too sad, they're too painful, they're too emotionally wrenching. Winterson, immediately after she identified the existence of the story's silent twin, went on to say, "There are so many things that we can't say because they're too painful. And we hope that the things we can say will soothe the rest or appease it in some way." There are a lot of stories that clinicians never tell, even to each other, much less to persons outside the professions. There are things we see and hear, things we do that are difficult enough as they occur, and that we just cannot, and perhaps should not, force ourselves to revisit, nor force on our listeners like family members who, after all, have not signed up for those experiences. Instead, we may find ourselves talking around the deeply painful, the deeply disturbing core of the story, finding success in a circuit, as Dickinson suggested, refashioning the narrative in the hope that we may be able to soothe, to appease the lingering horror of what happened, what we saw, and what we did. But there's yet another reason that we cannot tell the story's silent twin, and this is the one I really want to focus on, is that we don't really know the truth. Certainly not all of it. We don't know all there is to know. Maybe even especially in our own stories. We don't really have any choice but to tell it slant, as we see it, what we grasp of it from our own inescapably skewed perspectives. Dickinson says that the truth's superb surprise is just too bright, too blindingly, painfully bright, so it has to be revealed only gradually. But it isn't just the one listening to the story, reading the story, to whom the truth may come as a surprise and have to be sort of gradually brought into it. When we tell our stories, we're also going to be in for some big surprises, superb or otherwise. That is, it is important for us to tell our stories in some fashion because we learn from them. We come to understand more of what's true in the events that we recount. Those particles of experience begin to resolve themselves into the wave of narratives that have formed us, and we come to see ourselves that much more clearly. It's not just that we can't tell all the truth, it's that we can't see the truth We can't recognize it sometimes until we've said it. I used to say it laughingly, I don't know what I think until I see what I say. I've heard that before. And I'm learning that it's true. We said it and then come back to it, look at it again, and maybe finally see what's been waiting there for us, waiting for us to become open to. Winterson again. When we tell a story, we exercise control, but in such a way as to leave a gap, an opening. And I think that this gap we often leave unconsciously. We don't know necessarily that there's a gap when we're telling it. We may think we are telling the whole story, but it's a version and never the final one. I've certainly experienced this truth when reading or hearing other people's stories, that there are things in there, I expect you've had this experience too, that there are things in there that the author or the teller seems not to have seen or to have interpreted much differently from the way that I, reading it, hearing it, the way that I interpret it. Let me give you an example from a book of doctor stories that I really much admire. I even took this book as a model when I wrote my own book of stories. Dr. Scannell, Kate Scannell, is an infectious disease specialist who cared for AIDS patients in San Francisco in the earliest years of the epidemic, somewhere in the mid-80s. And these stories in her book, The Death of a Good Doctor, are from that experience. And in one of the chapters that's titled Loving Someone to Death, she writes about a young man who is dying of AIDS and about his strident, angry, dominating mother who makes life pretty miserable for the staff. And as Scannell sees it, the mother will not allow her son to release him to death that Scannell thinks he so clearly needs. His condition's hopeless. He's swollen beyond recognition with fluid and with air. His skin is decomposing. It's falling away. He smells really bad. He suffers cardiac arrest almost daily. Yet his mother insists on his resuscitation, and somehow, each time, he comes back from the arrest, even enough to regain the eerie, disconcerting smile that he always has on his face, and that suggests both that he still has consciousness, but also that he agrees with it, he appreciates his mother's demands. Well, after pages of description that emphasize the horror of his ongoing existence and the impossibility of dealing with his mother, Scannell comes to believe that she has now understood what's going on between them. She explains what she thinks to the patient and his mother, and then she acts unilaterally to end the treatment and to allow him to die, without asking his mother's permission. For me, as physician reading this story for the first time, Scannell enabled me through her really quite fine writing. She enabled me to be present for this disastrous dilemma skillfully enough that I found myself easily agreeing with her and thinking she had done the right thing. But when my bioethics students read this story, not my medical students, these are students who they don't have much clinical experience, when they read the story, they immediately reacted to it, seeing something I had not seen, and I rather think Scannell maybe didn't see, even though it's there because she wrote it into the story. What they saw is that this doctor is utterly disgusted by this patient. To her, he's a monster. He's no longer human. Her descriptions of him are unsparing. And in one brief but very telling scene, when she goes to write the orders that will end his treatment, she discovers that a piece of his skin is clinging to her hand. And immediately, she goes over to the sink and scrubs and scrubs and scrubs it, trying to erase the contaminating experience of having touched such a creature. And it becomes clear, became clear, after hearing my students' reaction to the story, that her anger at being put in such a position just suffuses that story. She doesn't ask herself in the story whether her certainty that she has understood that he too would like to stop treatment is really her certainty that he is too repulsive to continue living, no matter his wishes. Now, let me be clear. I do not know what Dr. Scannell was thinking or why she wrote the story she did. I don't know what she thinks about it now, whether, for example, she's been blessed with students who challenge her. And surely the motivations for, the moral nuances of the kind of decisions that she had to make are complex. They're not reducible to either her interpretation or mine. But the point is that it is her having written the story that enables us to see her response to this patient, perhaps in a way that she did not, and that then challenges us to see that kind of response in ourselves. When my students reacted this way to the story, I began recalling stories of my own in which I was quite sure that I had acted in a very difficult situation, had acted wisely and morally and responsibly. But now I realized I had to ask myself what I missed, what went without saying, what went without noticing, to ask myself what the silent twins to my own stories might have to say. Well, several years ago, I did write a book of stories from my years in pediatrics, attending children. And sometimes I do think about, especially after having a discussion about a story like Scannell's with my students, I think about the stories that are not in there and why they're not, why I can't or won't or just don't tell them. But I also think about what I've learned about the stories that are in there. A few years after the book came out, a professor at the University of Richmond assigned it to his class health policy. And I even came to the class one afternoon and talked with his students about it. And later on, he sent me copies of short response papers that he'd had them write in relation to selected stories. And in one of those papers, I will tell you, I do not now remember what story the student was writing about, which just goes to show how my memory can be really selective, or maybe how my forgettery is good at protecting me. But anyway, when I read it, what the student said about the story was, he said, Dr. Mohrmann was afraid, so she did something about it. And when I read that, I thought, no, I wasn't. I wasn't afraid. So I went back to the story in question to prove it. And rereading it with this new thought in mind, I saw, well, maybe I was. Maybe there was more going on than I thought. The ghost in the story was visible to that student, and now his response was making it visible to me. And perhaps we hope that the silences will be heard by someone else, and the story can continue, can be retold. And sometimes the someone else who's hearing, reading, seeing the ghost in the story is the writer herself. In 2005, when the book was published, I discussed it. I read some of my stories in this forum, Medical Center Hour. And I started off with two stories that came from the first months of my internship. There were situations in which I did a frankly terrible job of telling parents that their child had died. They formed the first chapter of the book, which I titled Telling Death. And in the second of the narratives in that chapter, my primary blunder was to ask the child's mother, the child I was caring for who was dying, to ask his mother for permission for an autopsy without having yet told her that her son was dead. And it was years after that Medical Center Hour, it was years later, on the occasion of telling this tale yet again to yet another audience, that for the first time I saw what I had written. She took the papers from my hand and signed them. I had gone to the waiting room to talk with her with the autopsy papers in my hand. I had no idea what they were doing there, but that piece of information changes what I thought I knew about this story, because obviously I went to her intending to ask permission for the autopsy. It didn't just bumble out of my mouth because I couldn't think of anything else to say. It was intentional. And I have no memory of whether someone told me I had to do it and put the papers in my hand, or whether it was my own bright idea. The point is that I wrote it into the story and I didn't see it. I didn't grasp the significance of that detail as I wrote it. I think we may always write more than we think we know, and we surely write what we don't know. We inevitably tell the truth slant because that's how we see it. Another of my stories in this book is of a child I cared for during my residency years, a patient who was really was for me the defining patient of my career. She was a 12-year-old girl, Mickey, who died of leukemia. She was my patient for about 6 months from the time of her diagnosis until she died. And in many complex ways, she's been my guide ever since. There's a lot to be said about her and her family and my experiences with them. Her chapter is one of the longest in the book. But here's the part of the story that I want to tell you today. When Mickey was dying, she was in the PICU, she was blind and bald and coming in and out of consciousness. We medical folks insisted that she had to be on protective isolation because she had so little resistance to infection. So her parents and all of us, everyone that came to see her, wore gowns and masks around her. Well, one day, when I was in the room with her and her mother, Mickey woke up and I went over to see if she needed anything, and here's what I wrote. I stood by the bed, my hand resting lightly on her pale, bald scalp. She mumbled, "I want to kiss someone." That story is still a difficult one for me to tell, that moment. When she said that, I waved her mother over. I told her she could pull her mask down and kiss her daughter. And in the book, I identified that moment as the point at which I realized that having her on isolation was absurd. That it was a denial of the obvious, that she was dying irretrievably. It didn't matter if it was infection, it was the final blow. And it was a cruelty to her and her parents who wanted nothing more than cradle her in their arms. But when I wrote that scene, almost 30 years after it had happened, having had it in my mind all this time, when I wrote it down for the first time in all those years, the thought occurred to me that when she said she wanted to kiss someone, she may have meant me. Now, I have no idea whether she did or not, and that's not actually the point. The point is that it was only because I was writing it and reliving it, putting myself back in that scene as my 30 years older self, that an interpretation occurred to me that was literally unthinkable when I was 26. Now, when I was writing this book, I pushed that new thought aside. I did not include it literally in the book. I didn't know what to do with it. But the scene is still there. It's in writing now. It's printed. I can't escape it. The story's silent twin, what's there, embedded in the narrative but unexpressed, still calls me to think again about who I was then, how I understood myself, how I understood doctrine. To think about what kept me from considering other meanings for her request. It's because I've written it and reread it and retold it that it can still reach out and tap me on the shoulder and say, think again. What else was going on here? What else were you blind to? Who were you then? Who are you now? When we write, we offer the silence as much as the story. Words are the part of the silence that can be spoken. So, what did writing and speaking, talking, do to me? What difference has it made that I have told and retold stories of my doctoring experience? I think the answer to that has to do with the phrase that may well have become the theme of my life over these years. It certainly has been the theme of my teaching. It all has to do with paying attention. Writing my stories and attending children, that's what the attending part is about paying attention. writing my stories and then the aftermath of that writing has made me so much more open to what's going on in them, open to recognizing that gap that Winterson speaks of, the what's not said that ensures that the story really is only a version and never the final one. It's taught me quite firmly what Marcia was talking about earlier, the mutuality of this storytelling enterprise, the ways in which stories are really communal project, that the readers or listeners, even the author as reader or listener, are indeed co-constructors of the story and are as likely, sometimes more likely, to see what's in there as the storyteller is. Where that necessarily takes me is to the practice of paying attention now. That is, there's as much depth and complexity in the stories I'm living now as there were in the ones that I have written about. And recognizing the existence of the silent twin in those old stories leads me to search for it in new ones. It enables me to practice paying attention, looking at those old stories, to see that there's always more going on than I think, that my interpretations are not the only ones, may not be the ones that best fit the whole story, and that other participants, like patients, like students, may well be seeing more than I do, certainly other than I do, and that I need to welcome their interpretations also. This learned openness to what's going on, to knowing that there's always more going on than I can see, this openness to asking what else is there, also made me very receptive when my colleague in the Center for Biomedical Ethics and Humanities, Lois Shepard, came to me with the idea that there's something important to be said about the necessity of an open, welcoming orientation in the practice of medicine. So we've been working for the past few years towards a book-length treatment of that topic, and its importance for medical ethics and for excellence in clinical care and for the organization of medical institutions like this one. And once we started looking at things through the lens of welcome, we started to see all the opportunities, all the ways in which being really welcoming makes us better at what we so want to do well, including hearing and seeing our patients as they are and as they need us to know them. Of course, we also started seeing all the ways in which we as individuals and as institutions are not particularly welcoming. And our work has spun off so far an initial journal article that we published last summer, whose title really sums up our point, and the point to which it seems all this writing and speaking has brought me to at this point. Ready to listen. Why welcome matters. For me, having written and told and reread and retold my stories, and having learned to see that there's always a ghost in the story, even if I can't always see all of the story's silent twin. For me, that recognition has, I think, made me readier than ever to listen, to pay close attention to what's going on and to what's not going on, to what's being said and to what's not being said. And so, maybe I may actually be ready now to write some poetry. We'll see what Danny has to say about that.
It's a perfect opportunity to welcome the audience. It's always humbling to follow Margaret on the podium, and I wasn't quite sure what she was going to talk about when I thought about what I was going to talk about. But as I was listening, or at the very beginning, I thought, well, I can probably quote Emily Dickinson on truth and how to tell it slant, and but I got scooped on that. But one other interesting fact about Emily Dickinson is if you take any of her poems, you can sing it to the tune of Amazing Grace. But don't do that. Don't do that right now. Ernest Hemingway, when he talked about his fiction, said something about how important it was to leave a lot of stuff out. he would write a first draft, and then he would take everything that sounded really good and take it out of the story. He wanted the story to sort of stand on its own or float on its own, sort of like an iceberg. There's a lot under the surface that makes it work. And just to extend the physics metaphor of particle versus wave theories of light, Margaret's comments made me think about dark matter in the universe, that there's something out there that we have to, without it we can't understand the amount of energy and matter in the universe. Most of my writing has been fiction in the form of poetry or short stories, and so I've sort of dodged the whole issue of truth, because I went into writing from being a clinical epidemiologist because I wanted to make it up. So this is, and I've got a few slides that mostly I'm going to improvise around because I wasn't sure what Margaret was going to say. So this is actually a piece of art that one of my patients made and gave it to me. What you need to know is that she was legally blind when she made this. That she could barely walk, but she walked from the nursing home on Gordon Avenue to the Beta Bridge and had college boys and girls peel the paint from the bridge in order to create these collages. On the back of this piece of art, she pasted a poem called At the Beta Bridge, written by Eleanor Ross Taylor, who was as Emily Dickinson-like as any 20th century poet could be. So this is by a patient named Emily Cushman and Eleanor Ross Taylor, the poet. So both of these people were my patients. So I'm very aware of these not so, maybe chance, but maybe something more than chance that allows me to connect some of these dots. I like to quote Robert Frost on writing. I write in order to learn the things I didn't know I knew. Fact is, he didn't say that, so this is something that I wished he had said, because I tried to look this up. I don't know how I decided that Robert Frost said this, but often in the process of writing, we discover things, and then years later, we discover that what we were trying to say is actually something different. And those of you who are writers in the audience, or about anybody telling the story, you may forget the punchline, and then you'd have to provide a new punchline, and sometimes that makes a better story. Certainly in the process of writing a poem, you start off going one direction, and then for some reason, the language perhaps, or the length of the line, forces you to go in another direction, and it may be a more interesting direction, you just don't know. I wanted to say something about craftsmanship, because I think this applies to anybody doing work as a teacher, or as a healthcare provider, or as a scientist. It takes years and years and years of practice to get it right. And when you do get it right, it's very satisfying. And that applies to writing a grant, preparing a lecture, doing a journal article, doing the statistics right, or getting the poem into the shape you want it, or knowing when to end the story. A little bit about revision, because those of us who write, or those of us who reread and reinterpret what we write, it's never ending. I used to have a t-shirt that said, revise, revise, revise. Inspired by Walt Whitman, who started writing Leaves of Grass as a young man and really never finished it. So there you have a young Walt Whitman and an old Walt Whitman. I think anyone in the audience has a story to tell. We're always sharing stories. And a lot of us, want to plan, want to write the story down, and some way we're going to do it. So we've all suffered writer's block, and a colleague of mine termed this primary terminal writer's block, talking about the problem that so many doctors have, that they want to be a writer one day. They want to share what they've experienced, but they never quite get around to it. And so there is a treatment. This is a picture of the group of people at Taos in last August. Almost everybody who comes to a retreat like this doesn't think they can be a writer, and usually they discover that they can write. It takes about an hour before they've started to write and realize that it can be done, and it can be done well. So again, I wanted to really thank Margaret and the audience, and we have time for questions now.
I'd like to thank both of you, Margaret for a brave and beautiful talk, and Danny for some insightful comments, and a small plug for the Taos Writing Retreat this summer, which I'm sure would welcome sign-ups. We have some time for discussion with you, your comments and questions. There may be some writers lurking in the audience. There may be some physicians lurking in the audience. And there may be some who combine the two. So John will bring you a mic, and there's somebody down here as well. So please give your name before you ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Thomas Ball. I'm a first-year medical student here. Thank you both for what you shared. My question is, having gone through medical school and then with the benefit of your life experience and career experience, looking back, if you were to structure or have some sort of framework to writing that you would do while you were going through school, are there themes that you'd sort of focus on, or I guess what sort of approach would you take? And do you have any advice to current students?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, and I'd like to hear what Danny has to say to it too. I don't know about themes to focus on, because I think they're going to be the themes that you find as opposed to being imposed on you. But I think the thing that I wish I had done now, and that I often talk to students about doing, and I know Marcia does this too, is about developing even the smallest bit of discipline in writing. And what I mean by that is I have talked to, well, I give a commencement address at the medical school at the University of Utah a couple of years ago, and this is what I talked to them about. I had done their white coat address, and so I came back and said, okay, what have you got in the pockets of that coat? And because, you know, you always have your peripheral brain there, all the sort of stuff you need, the PDA or whatever it is that gives you all the information at your fingertips you can use for taking care of patients. So but what you don't have is your peripheral spirit, something in there that when something happens that doesn't fit any of the stuff in all the medical algorithms, something miraculous, mysterious, unexplainable, wonderful, awful happens, you need to be able to also deal with that. And the dealing with it means write it down in some fashion so it's there, make it real, and come back to it when you can. So just keep a little notebook in there and just do those, just these jottings. And I assure them, I'm not talking about keeping a journal. I mean, nobody needs another task like that, and if you're not a journal keeper, you're not going to become a journal keeper. I'm not really talking about that. I'm talking about when things happen, noticing, and that practice of doing that, I think, makes you a better noticer. In fact, I rather think the more you do it, the less you need to do it because you remember it. But by the time you're doing it, you're going to want to, if you know what I mean. So that is a piece of advice I would give people, is just keep something handy and make the intention that when there's something going on that you don't understand, it's one of those why questions that never get answered in medical school, right? One of those questions, write it down. We'll get started.
Good question. So I guess I'm not allowed to say get a journal and keep it. I'm going to be careful when I say this, but I steal from patients a lot. I listen really. I'm interested in how they say things, and often they say things in ways that are unforgettable. So I think that's an ear for language. And you do need to write it down. You have to figure out how to memorize it. But so T.S. Eliot said that talent borrows and genius steals, but he stole that line from William Blake, the poet. So I think it's okay to do it, but you have to be careful to decontextualize it. If you recycle it, you have to use it in an original way. And what Margaret and I guess we should throw out the word narrative medicine, which is really, I think, the proper quilt, patchwork quilt that would go all around all of this discussion. Find the story. Those of you who are students or nurses or have the opportunity to read in EPIC, the electronic medical record, there's a total lack of story in what now counts as the electronic medical record. It's all tables. So somebody needs to put the story back into those notes.
I will add that when medical students move from second year into third year and begin their clinical work, this medical school does give you a little pocket notebook and encouragement to write, even if it's just a word or two, to serve as that reminder. And those notebooks can carry those stories with you until you have time to really sit down and write them out.
Hi, thanks so much, Margaret and Dan. That was wonderful. Lynn Nolan, School of Nursing, Division of Nephrology. I guess this is primarily for Margaret, and I would ask you to address the risks and the benefits and burdens of discovering the silent twin, especially in light of the lack of time that we have to explore meaning in our practice.
I guess there are risks of discovering the silent twin. My immediate response to that comes up is that I think we're so well protected that we'll only see what we're ready to see. That's certainly been my experience. You know, it was 30 years before I could see that possibility in what Mickey had said. I'm not sure we're in great danger of this because I think we are so well protected that, you know, the Buddhist saying, when you're ready for the teacher will come? I think there's a lot to that. When you have the time to look, you will see. Before you have the time, you won't. So I'm not sure time is going to be a problem, except in the sense that it's just putting off your doing that, because it does require time.
There's also a risk of not paying attention to that.
Letting it escape you. So since we've been quoting people, Henry James said, try to be someone on whom nothing is lost. And that's part of what this is about. That paying attention, trying to be someone on whom nothing is lost. Because in our business, if you lose things, if something's lost on you, that may really have significant consequences for the work you do.
Hi, my name is Kate. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the nursing school, and my primary research interest is in the therapeutic potential of storytelling for patients. And so I really appreciate your lecture today and the work that you're doing, and I just wanted to add the notion that as healthcare providers, we are not only great tellers of story, but great keepers of stories, hundreds of patient stories, and that we should bear in mind when we're listening to patient stories that we should look for the silent twin not only for our own therapeutic benefit for the patient, that we may be able to hear what they're telling us that they need us to do, but we may be able to reflect back to them the silent twin that they're not seeing in their own story. And I think my background is in oncology and palliative care, and so especially when we're talking to patients about end-of-life decision-making, that being the keeper and good listeners of their stories can be very therapeutic for them as well.
I think that's a really interesting point, although it also brings to mind some of the risk that Lynn's talking about, because you have to be very careful in presenting that back to someone who's not seeing it. I'll quote somebody else. My only favorite quote from G.K. Chesterton: "Don't tear down a fence till you know what was put up." People have defenses for good reasons, and you have to be really careful with that. So it's information that you've got, or you think you have, because of course it's your interpretation, and you do have to be careful about how you use that as opposed to wielding it as a therapeutic tool. But otherwise, I would already agree with you.
Now I have to quote Chesterton.
Okay,
also.
good.
He said sometimes a small lie saves tons of explanation.
My name is Pranay. I'm one of the fourth-year medical students and author of an awful blog that probably set up an epidemic of depression around amongst my friends when I wrote about global health issues in India. And I think, and then later I sort of started writing about my experiences on the stroke ward when I was in my neurology clerkship. And I think the question I have is really about about that danger of overwhelming your audience with sadness. And while I completely now sympathize with that because my friends won't read my blog, I also wonder how in fact necessary it is to actually write it and write it such to denude the story from the euphemisms that we litter, our presentations with. The lady is uncomfortable. There is, she's in acute distress. I mean, air hunger is not, I think, it doesn't, the term acute distress doesn't do it justice, at least from what I've seen. So, I was wondering, when you revisit these stories, do you sometimes wish that you had actually written, put the full, I'm being deeply inarticulate here, actually not held back from the undiluted horror that we do see on the ward sometimes. And if there is a benefit to at least the physicians and nurses who read these things, to see that and recognize that it is okay to feel overwhelmed because these things are actually scary and not put up this wall of defenses, which may lead us to sometimes dilute our humanism in our practice. So, kind of a very unwieldy question. I apologize for that.
It's okay. I understand the question, and I wish I had an answer. I think it's a very delicate balance one walks between telling all the truth but telling it slant, to tell it in a way that it can be heard, because putting out there what really goes on, as you say, may be a good thing to do, but if nobody will look at it, then you haven't accomplished what you wanted to accomplish. So it may be the case that one has to be circuitous. This is what Dickinson's talking about, that you have to sort of work around it to get to the truth surprise, that blinding light of the truth surprise. If your object is to have people pay attention to what you're saying, then you may have to work them into it. You may have to work yourself into doing that too. I think that's a difficult balance to strike. There were in the book of stories that I wrote, which I think are pretty mild stories, compared to some of the things that go on in medicine. I had people who didn't get past the first few chapters, refused to keep reading it, because they said it was just too hard. All I was doing was crying. Oh, heavens. Really. And we lose sight of that in medicine. We lose sight of how bad this stuff is. How really wrenching it is because we're inured to it. The routinization of what we do really undercuts that for us, and there's nothing like telling some little routine story to somebody who's not here to realize how much we've lost that sense. So I think it's very difficult to know how to transmit and whether it's really necessary to transmit all the horror in order to make the points that we want to make.
I think that's a great question. It's a very writerly question because it's about craft. And it's about diction and what kind of a tone you want to establish. Ezra Pound said you need to choose the luminous details. And if you put too much gore into it, people are going to go numb and they're not going to respond in any way. So the other answer would be just keep revising.
So our advice to all of you is, at the end of our hour, is just keep revising. But I'd like to thank Dr. Margaret Mohrmann and Dr. Danny Becker for wonderful talks in this hour. And please join us here next week We have Nora Bateson, the daughter of the great 20th century thinker Gregory Bateson, with excerpts from her prize-winning documentary film about her father. Also Stephen Nachmanovich, who was a student of Bateson's. This program is about the legacy of Gregory Bateson with some lessons for clinical practice. It's part of a Bateson symposium going on here at UVA at the end of next week. So please join us for that program, which will be our final Medical Center Hour for the season. Thank you again, and please some applause for Dr. Swan.